Food banks have been in Canada across it from coast to coast for about 40 years. The London Food Bank, for instance, is now moving into its 39th year in the fall. We were there at the beginning. We saw what was beginning to take place. Food banks were born during a recession. The first food bank started up just prior to ours in Edmonton, Alberta. And it was because there were structural changes going on in the communities that people had trouble understanding. Prior to that time, Canada had developed a pretty strong and rigorous system of social supports to help people. That was about healthcare, for about cheap university education, also for people that were on seasonal employment, let's say like people in the fish industry, that would help them to keep going forward. And social programs themselves, like what was called unemployment insurance back then, it's called employment insurance now, meant to help people as they transitioned or had trouble finding work. I mean, there was a lot going on. Canada had a very integrated social system and a very integrated capitalist system. And it worked. And it worked for a lot of countries, not just for Canada. But in the 80s, countries began to realize that this globalization was opening up. As the world was starting to open up, there was real possibilities for trade and for investment and transferring monies elsewhere or to here. And so as that went on, suddenly the wealth in the country, although it was high and was being produced at a great measure, was able to leave the country. Prior to then, there had been regulations that didn't permit that. That wasn't just true here, but in other nations as well. Part of the globalization effort was to allow people in Canada to take their money and invest elsewhere. So the money that was made and used to be invested back in Canada through government support programs and other things suddenly began to dry up more and more, and different regions suffered more and more than others. This is what was taking place. So in that time, suddenly hunger began appearing on our streets. Homelessness itself, it began to appear in communities as well. And people were wondering what was going on. And governments didn't seem to have an answer for it during that recession in the 80s. So people came together, and one of the things they really cohabitated around was food and food insecurity. And food banks were caught in that moment. They started at that moment and became the object of huge public support and business support. So all of a sudden now people were able to donate food or donate money for food that went out to food banks and then was distributed to various groups. We were around during those years. The Canadian Association of Food Banks, now called Food Banks Canada, one of its inaugural meetings was right here in London at Western University. We were charter members of that to help it go forward. And then the Ontario Association of Food Banks, now called Feed Ontario, also had much of its beginnings here in London as well. We, at that time, way back in 1986, 87, there were just a few food banks around. So there was Kitchener, there was Kingston, Toronto, obviously, Windsor, Chatham, ourselves. And so we began to try to meet. We didn't know one another, but we began to meet at different locations and map out a strategy as how we could develop a kind of provincial reach that food banks could have from working with food companies and others. And they were successful. And it's important to note that during those pivotal 2 years, the city of Montreal came and joined us. Quebec did not have its own provincial association. They saw that Ontario was moving ahead with this and they wished to be part of it. Part of that is because they needed help and guidance like we all did. We were all new to it. And also there were a lot of food companies and things like that in Ontario, a lot of farming in Ontario. And they were hoping to get a hold of some of those products to help their own people in Quebec. That's how it started. And so as it moved forward over the years, food banks came in all sorts of models. There were some food banks that were run by unions. There were others, many of them, that were run by faith groups of all different kinds of faiths to try to help people. We know all about those ones. But there was just all this kind of innovation going on. In London, it was kind of different. We didn't want any government money, so we never took it. At one point, the provincial government offered Ontario food banks, and I was there in on that meeting in Queen's Park, when they offered food banks $1 million to try to help them through that recession. We said no. We didn't want to set up that kind of operation because we did feel it was a governmental responsibility to help take care of the vulnerable. But because this was a crisis and because we were in a recession, we would just keep going on as we did. And so that's what we did. And as time grew on, food banks began developing different models. So the bigger ones all started moving towards helping other agencies. And that was important, and I think a lot of those agencies were thankful because they were having great trouble at getting food. Others, especially the smaller ones, concentrated on helping people just coming into them directly. So it was the food bank helping them. It wasn't the food bank working with other agencies. That kind of went on for decades even, and even to this day, you've got food banks that either do one or the other. London is fairly unique. From the very beginning, we decided that we would help other agencies and help people and families that were struggling. So when we first started, at the very, very beginning and had our very first food drive, we had told the London public and we had told the media that 50% of the food that came from that drive would go to other agencies. That was very uncommon. 50% would go to them, and then 50% would stay with us at the food bank to feed our own clientele, which was mushrooming at that time. I remember at the very first few months, we had like 200, 300 people a month coming for help. Now it's up at 6,000 families per month. You know, I mean, it's thousands and thousands and thousands of people a month coming to the food bank directly. So yes, things have changed a lot that way. But when the pandemic came, and we were part of the meetings with the mayor, we've talked about that before. But when the pandemic came and organizations began to shut down, or limit times of operation, or even limit physical contact for volunteers or staff or whatever, it grew to be a real challenge. And the food bank decided at that time that what it would try to do is open up more and more resources to those agencies to help them as they were moving through things. That opened up a new era for us. I think prior to the pandemic, we probably were helping 20 agencies, and they were core agencies like the Salvation Army and Mission Services, those groups, the ones that were helping lots and lots of people. But even prior to the pandemic, lots of groups were starting up and operating, and they were working basically outside of the system. They weren't part of that original system, but they were responding to the needs that were there. So you would see homeless agencies start up. You'd see food agencies start up, agencies that help refugees that came in. A lot of these things were all starting up. And it was quite a time of variety and quite a time of collaboration as well. But we were also all trying to figure out where we were going and what was going to happen in our communities. It was clear that governments at all levels had pulled back from these social supports and had allowed community to come forward and do that work. The problem is that government had lots of resources it could give towards those things. Communities themselves and the agencies within those communities all had to struggle to find those resources and also to develop a system that would coordinate with one another. So when the pandemic came, the food bank suddenly started taking on all sorts of other agencies as well. Now those agencies during the pandemic, it was really interesting. I mean, some of them weren't even so much around direct social service, but they were places that really need food to be able to help their neighborhoods or neighborhood resource centers or things like that. So we took it all on. We just said that as a food bank, we'll do it. Now we need to remember at that time, this is really important. The public was really giving to the food bank, like seriously giving to the degree that we had never seen before. And that's a really important piece. So suddenly we were doing very well. We had all sorts of volunteers come in. We'll talk about that on another segment. But we were doing really, really well at the same time that other organizations were struggling. Part of the reason for that was because media itself was having trouble responding to the food bank. You know, they had to obey the pandemic rules as well. So it wasn't easy. The food bank was just out there and doing its thing. So what ended up happening is we helped a lot of agencies during that time. Homeless Lunch Program is a good example. We started it up, and I think we were helping like 25 other groups that we had never helped before. And we had paid for the homeless lunches that RBC Place would make. 519 Pursuit or Youth Opportunities Unlimited would distribute those meals. But they had to go to organizations, too, that really needed help. So we helped groups during that time, many of them that you would know. I don't want to say them because I'll miss out on a few, I'm sure. But suddenly, over 30 new groups came into that system. So as the pandemic was going on, it was wonderful. There was lots of collaboration, lots of good things taking place. And then the pandemic began to close up. And, government supports had been there to help people individually, but collectively in agencies and things like that, it had been tough. So now as the pandemic had begun to wear down to something of a close, we discovered that a lot of these agencies could not go back to the way it was before. A good example would be faith groups. Prior to the pandemic, faith groups, I go to a United Church here in town, but they were already dwindling. Religion in Canada was losing out to a more secular state, but churches themselves, would, as small as they were in some cases, they were always doing what they believed was their mandate, which was to help people that were vulnerable. So they would have food programs or suppers or whatever it is that they did for people that were in need. We helped those groups during the pandemic, but then when the pandemic ended and churches were able to meet again, not as many of the congregants came back. So the problem that they faced and still face to this day was that the pandemic resulted in a number of people just kind of dropping off of church attendance. When the pandemic ended and the churches tried to get going again, yes, they had the services again as they did before and young people's programs and other things. But they also had feeding programs to help people. The problem was their donation base within their own church was half maybe of what it used to be. Now that was a real problem because the number of people in need was growing in neighborhoods and churches were scrambling and Muslim organizations, Hindu organizations, and others, they were all scrambling to try to meet the needs in their own communities. So as a food bank, we realized that our best bet was to just continue to help them. We won't wrap it up as we thought we would when the pandemic had ended. And so we just said we would keep helping them. And that's what we did. So it wasn't just them, it's other well-known community organizations that have been around for decades. We're very much in the same boat. The supports were not there as they came back to the degree that they used to be before. Now that's important. I mean, you have to remember the reason why food banks started at the first recession is because after that recession was over, government supports never came back to what they were before. They were less. In the next recession in the early 90s, the same thing happened. In the early 2000s, the same thing happened. The Great Recession of 2007, the same thing happened. The supports continued to erode. Lots of wealth was being generated and was being dispersed around the world and to some degree brought here, but it wasn't nearly enough to meet the needs, and so governments cut back. So by the time you get to the pandemic, the governments of all levels were able to help people individually to stay home, and then through things like CERB and other things, groups were helped, individuals were helped, but agencies were really in trouble. So now we're in a situation as a food bank. Here it is, it's a couple of years after the pandemic has ended. And we're now helping way over double of what we were helping before it started. And the reason why we can do that is not because we were so good at those kind of things or organizing. It's because the public kept its support up. Our numbers of volunteers doubled during the pandemic, and they didn't go anywhere after the pandemic ended. They stayed, and they continue to make it work. Right? But it's also true with support from the community and from the business community. We don't take government money. That's just not what we do. There are many groups that do that, and they're right to do that because government needs to provide services and needs to contract out to groups. But they're vulnerable to the vagaries of government and the political structure. At one election, you'll get this group that says this, and the next election will be replaced by another group that does the opposite. So all these groups that are able to get government funds all of a sudden found themselves in trouble. So I think the food bank, we sat down as a board, and we've got a great board at the food bank. I mean, they know what's going on. They're out in the community, and we have these philosophical discussions about what we should do. And Jane and I said, look, we think it's time that we really modified our work as a food bank and began integrating ourselves even more with other agencies. Some of that we talked about before in these videos about the community resource centers and what we did there and how that operation has kept up. The same with the homeless lunch program. Well, that's also true with many of the other social agencies that we have worked with. We have kept up those contacts. But since that happened and we were helping, the government cutbacks now have begun to really take effect. So you have London organizations, London agencies. Some have been cut by 100% from government, some by less. But it's a very difficult time for these agencies. And what they're doing now is they're coming to us. So churches are a good example. Churches or houses of faith come to us and they say, can you help us do what we are doing? In the past, it was always the other way around. In the past, it was always the food bank was giving out food. Churches were having food drives, or faith groups were having food drives, and they delivered that. The food bank would distribute it that way. Now it was the other way around. Now we were trying to help them out of public largesse, to help them get out to people who are struggling with low income or other challenges, homelessness, other things in their neighborhoods. So that's what we have done. We have decided that we'll just take those groups on and we'll keep them on. So just 2 months ago, we sat down as a board and Jane and I presented a kind of pathway for the future that we saw. And so we started talking about these different agencies that were all having trouble. Some of them we supported, some of them we didn't, but they were all critical to care. There are many people out there who say, you know, there's just way too much duplication going on out there in social services. That is just not true. I mean, there's lots of groups helping the homeless and lots of groups helping the hungry or refugees or whatever. It's absolutely true, there are. But as government pulls back, nobody has the wherewithal as one particular group to cover it all. So they all move in their neighborhoods and other things and try to provide. I mean, that argument of duplication, that's something that funders and others can argue about all they want. But the truth of the matter is those groups are providing care, and in some cases critical care, to help different organizations, individuals, and families that are vulnerable. So as a food bank, Jane and I said, we feel we should take on an extra 14 agencies, and we will fund them for 3 years. Now, those agencies, we're not trying to fund their operations or their staffing. What we're doing is we're funding them for food. So we've asked them, what is your annual food budget? And then we would cover it for 3 years. And that is what we're doing. That will cost us between $4 and $5 million over those 3 years to do that. But because the public has been so generous, we will be able to do that. We're trusting the public will continue to donate to the degree that they have. If they don't, then it won't work. But if they do, suddenly their largesse will start going out to not 20, but over 50 different agencies and helping all of those different groups. But it will all be towards food, nothing else. But that's one of the great changes that came about during the pandemic. I think there was some tough parts to it, some parts that weren't easy. But there were other parts in which we began to collaborate in ways as a community we had never done before. There's lots of talk going on out there, lots of agencies meeting with one another, trying to see how we can help. But more than anything, as I've always said, when food banks first got started and were so popular across the country, it was because the public wanted in. They were learning in their own communities that people were not being cared for to the degree that they were previously, and that the governments were not going to do it and fulfill their mandates or policies that they had initially given when they got elected. So they decided that they wanted to be involved in that system. So it's much like it used to be during the Depression. Now, I wasn't around then, most of you weren't either, but during the Depression, people would come along and help. Neighbor would be helping neighbor. Churches would be, and faith groups would be so involved at helping communities and others because there was hardly any government programs at that time. But it was such a jaw-dropping time of need during the Great Depression, during the 1930s, that it was hard. And before anybody could figure out how to answer that, World War II came along. Suddenly all the money went into industry, all the people that were out of work went into the Army or the Navy or the Air Force, and all of a sudden Canada was humming. All sorts of things were going on, as it was in the other industrialized nations, United States primarily. So it was really amazing. But after those people came home from the war, and they saw what could happen if people don't start looking out for human rights or taking care of one another, for humanitarianism, even for growing solid economies that include everybody, gives them equal opportunity. They came back and they began to press Canadian governments, successive ones, for change. So people like Lester Pearson and people like John Diefenbaker, different parties, but they worked together on certain things. And when it came to things like healthcare, things like that, Tommy Douglas from the NDP, different name back then, but they really helped and they moved the Canadian governments in that direction. So suddenly the wealth that was in Canada was concentrated in such a few areas, now began to be distributed amongst all, and the middle class boomed. But it wasn't just that. There were all schools, there was universities, there was the St. Lawrence Seaway, there was new airports, right? Trains going to different areas. Like, the middle class was really booming, the country was really booming. So all the others kind of pull back and they let the governments take care of all those people that were vulnerable or in need. Well, that's all over now. Governments are not going to do that. They promise that, but we are seeing this receding from their responsibilities, even though when they get elected, they say that they will do it. That means it's all up to you, and it's all up to me and my family, the people that I know, the people that you know, and the good people of London, Ontario, to step up. Is it the answer? Absolutely not. There are many people who just delight in the fact that charities are helping people. The problem is that the people that are supporting those charities are having to pay way too much for groceries, for rent, and it's the standard of living has begun to drop. It's really hard. So it was way better when governments assumed their responsibilities and did their jobs and were accountable. Now we're at a whole other areas where governments are receding, communities are stepping up, but it's a whole new ball game. And it's really, really important that groups like the Food Bank that have the public support that they have, that they reach out and support other groups, and they let the public know that that's what we're doing. And we are. You'll see it all the time, that we're complementing these different groups that are doing great work. That all came about because of the pandemic. The pandemic forced these kind of things into having to happen. We talked before about how the Mayor Ed Holt brought all of these groups together and talked about what are we going to do. But those groups figured it out. And they began really working together. Some were really key, like the London Community Foundation or United Way. The Food Bank tried to concentrate on the food insecurity area and do what we could. But that system is still in place to this day. So when you donate to anybody within that system, they're not just going off on their own and doing their own thing. They are part of groups and meeting and trying to help and support one another. Some like ours that are doing well because of the public support, it's not due to us, but because of the public and business support, our responsibility is to help these other groups because they represent vulnerable Londoners. But those that aren't doing well and are really struggling right now, it's very hard for them to do so. So we all need to be there for one another because at some point it might be the food bank's turn that it's going to need help. But this system that's out there now, this generosity, this amount of groups that the food bank is helping, all of these different agencies, we were not doing that to any of that degree prior to the pandemic. The pandemic not only forced us to have to think beyond our own limited mandate, but to think of the city mandate, which we did. But it also liberated Londoners to be able to say, you know, I'm stuck at home, it's the pandemic, I don't know what I'm going to do, I'm getting my CERB check and I want to donate to charities or I want to volunteer at charities. And they chose the food bank as one of those options. It was wonderful. It is still wonderful to this day. It has endured. But our responsibility now that we have all of these other new duties that we have to do to other agencies is to continue to spread our resources to those areas. And that's what we do. It's not the same food bank as it was. We still help people directly, 6,000 families a month. It's tough. 32% of them are kids. I mean, it just breaks your heart. It's awful. But that's what we have to do. But at the same time, we're out there helping other agencies doing what they can. We always did that as a food bank, but not nearly to the degree that we are now. The pandemic made that happen. The good people of London, Ontario gave to that degree, even of their own time and resources. And the other agencies themselves, they hung in. They did what they could. And when somebody fell, others of us were there to help lift them up. And when groups like the Food Bank were trying to figure out what to do, some of them came to us with advice and helped us to know how to move forward. That came out of the pandemic. Part of the reason why this community has survived to the degree that it has is because all of those groups work together the way they have. And we need to remember that when we donate to those groups, they will be accountable. They'll move forward and try to help. It's an amazing thing, but the pandemic did it, and Londoners jumped on that, and they changed the equation through that course, and that is still working to this very day.